Ni hao. Very nice to be here, and thank you for this opportunity. I am going to be a little different than the other speakers. I'm going to stand back and think a little bit about why we have climate change negotiations in the first place, and whether there might be other ways to think about intervening on the important climate crisis that we've just heard about. So for those reasons, I want you to think about this as a seminar, okay? I'm going to make some arguments, but with the purpose of generating some discussion and some ideas. And I'd love to hear from those who are very much experienced in negotiations with these thoughts, okay? So my goal is simply to get us thinking perhaps somewhat creatively about other ways of thinking about addressing the climate crisis outside of international negotiations and treaties. Okay, so what I want to do is begin with the observation that for really over 30 years, international negotiations on climate change have been conceived as a global commons collective action problem, okay? And this is a collective action problem is a very strong theme within economics about how to address resource challenges. And the idea is that we have economic self-interest in addressing collective action problems. Okay? So it brings us towards an economic lens, both directly and indirectly. But the reason it's been conceived as a collective action problem is because it does not matter where the CO2 emissions come from. Okay? It does not matter what country produces the CO2 emissions. The same effect occurs in the atmosphere and on our planet. Okay? And hence, the argument by many economists and by some political scientists is that it is irrational for any state to act in the absence of international cooperation, because you simply have other states increasing their emissions. Okay, so this is this common way of looking at this collective action dilemma. In fact, this is the reason that President George Bush gave for not signing the Kyoto Protocol, because he argued, hey, China isn't committing to reductions, why should I? Okay, so this is the reason. But I want to argue, actually, that though well-intended, the collective action metaphor has truncated, okay, not improved global solutions. Okay? It's made matters worse, I want to argue. So I know this sounds provocative, but I'm going to make the argument, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay? So how could this be so? Okay? The global commons metaphor has focused emphasis on international treaties and international commitments. Okay? This has been the focus of how we can get to address the crisis we've just heard about. And the results have been very weak treaties. The science would tell us that our treaties to date have not yet come close to mandating the kinds of reductions you would need to address the climate crisis. So we're hoping that Paris will be different. But the past 30 years are fairly depressing in this regard. Okay? So we instead have commitments heralded as successes, okay? Countries commit to something in the future, but as time comes closer, they push off these commitments even more, okay? So commitments themselves are pretty flexible and not that durable. They become, in fact, I would argue, weaker and weaker as you get close and closer to the commitment itself. Okay, and this is despite, as we know from our previous speaker, accelerating risks that are now very clear from the climate science. What the science tells us about the nature of CO2 emissions and how we can avoid catastrophic effects. Okay, so the international treaties and commitments are becoming weaker, and the science is telling us the problem is becoming stronger. Okay, so I want to give you one example of commitments becoming weaker. I'm going to choose Canada. I could have chosen almost any country, okay? But I'm picking on Canada because I'm Canadian, okay? I'm going back, it's all of our problem, okay? It's not like China, US, Canada is also a problem, okay? All right, so in 2004, Canada, okay, signed the Kyoto Protocol. I think number 98 was a country to do so, okay? And so this was a very exciting time to be a Canadian, and we're very happy, okay? We committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions with this signing to 6% below 1990 levels by 2012. Oops, we're now 2015. We did not meet that commitment. I can tell you that because we passed 2012. In fact, the government, a few years later, a new government withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol, okay? But at the time, the Prime Minister said, climate change is an extremely important problem, so we do it today. Okay, he implied that they were doing it today. But they didn't do it today, they didn't do it even now, okay? The Minister of the Environment said the debate on whether to ratify is over. The debate is how to do it. Okay, so the rhetoric sounded great. And the environmental groups were happy, and I was happy, but it didn't happen, okay? In fact, May 15th, just a few days ago, the Canadian government says, as part of its Paris COP21 interactions, the Canadian government submitted its intended nationally determined contribution, INDC. And in international relations, as we know, every year there are new acronyms to discuss what is going on, and the latest is the INDC. And every country must submit an INDC, and Canada submitted its INDC. And this is what it said. It commits to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005. Well, you can't see that. 2005 by 2030. Okay? It's changed its commitments. And again, we seem happy about this, but if you go back 10 years, we realize this is a sad story, not a happy story. Okay. So, is there another approach we might want to take besides a treaty-based approach? Is there another way we might want to move forward? And I'm going to argue yes, and it requires changing our conceptualization of climate change as a problem, okay? Not as a global collective action problem, but as a super wicked problem, okay? Super wicked problem, which is an article that I've written with 3 colleagues that I'm happy to share with you. Now, the focus of a super wicked problem also requires us to reorient our policy solutions. So I'm going to first walk you through what we think is a super wicked problem, and then, based on that, indicate what that means for policy solutions. Okay, so what is a super wicked problem? There's 4 key features. Now I should tell you that wicked problems are actually a long-standing feature of the public policy literature, made famous by an article in 1972 in Policy Sciences by Rittel and Weber. And they talked about wicked problems being things that, problems that lack straightforward planning rules. You just can't initiate a policy and you get a result. It's much more complicated. And they said trial and error is often difficult for many wicked problems. So we said, you know, they're right, this is important, but there are 4 additional characteristics of super wicked problems that the climate crisis tells us are key. And so they are, first, time is running out. So at some point there's irreversibility, which means you can't always go back to the policy process and change the policy. At some point it's too late. Now many policies we know you can go back and forth and keep on changing. Healthcare policy, reproductive rights policies, but on this one, on climate change, you can't go back at some point, it's too late, okay? This is a cartoon that shows island states sinking while we're negotiating the latest paragraph for the agreement in 2160, okay? We keep on talking, things get worse, okay? The second, though, is that there is no central authority. There's no place to go to actually get the kinds of commitments we would actually need to be durable. So we get these false commitments thinking they're actually useful when they're not actually useful. Okay? The third, though, is that those seeking to end the problem are also causing it. This is not traditional politics where different groups debate different policies because of their own different interests. In this case, the very people who are causing the problems also have an interest in stopping the problem. For example, if you were to look at the per capita emissions of international negotiators on climate change treaties, they'd be very high, okay? I, as a professor who flies around the world giving talks, my emissions are really high, and yet I want to solve the problem, okay? So I'm causing the problem and I want to solve it, which means it's a unique kind of problem. The battle is with ourselves, okay? I have no time to give this, but the challenge is not just for climate, but whether it's trying to stop smoking, or losing weight, or looking at the internet too much, we always try and find ways to push our short-term selves to our long-term selves. We might say, for example, I'll pay somebody if I smoke a cigarette. It's a way of going to your longer-term self, okay? And this is what's needed with climate change. How do we think about our long-term selves, not just our short-term selves? And that's finally, the fourth point is that we therefore develop policies that discount the future irrationally. So for example, the science we just heard about, it's very clear we have to act. Most of us agree we have to act. Most of us want to act, and yet we're not developing policies that are consistent with the science, okay? So we're being irrational when it comes to our policies. And we say when super wicked problems exist, international treaties are going to be weak and won't be effective in addressing the problem. And this is because we've got a policy-making tragedy, which is that even though we recognize collectively the need to act now to avoid catastrophic impacts, the immediate implications of doing so overwhelm the political and policy process, and we don't. We rely on commitments that are very vague. Now, one solution to this, and I will not have time to go through all my slides. I get too excited and present too many slides, but I will send them to you free of charge along with my article, okay? But I want to highlight the key solution in our article that we think might be useful. And this is that we don't just focus on substance, i.e. emissions targets, but also on the ability to constrain our future collective selves. So what can we do when we design instruments that might constrain our future collective selves? And to that, we turn to literature on path dependency. Okay, so there's a literature in political science about the ways in which some policies are initiated and they create a path-dependent process that over time locks you into a certain future. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples on that, but I want us to think about then what's happened the last few years on whether policies have been durable or not. And if you look at this 2x2 table, here's an example of a policy change in arrows where you think it's durable and then it's not. It goes, so we call this false change. It changes and goes back to the original position. Okay? And this would be the Canadian 2004 commitment. Okay, we thought it was really good and it didn't work out. And so this is a bad way to think about climate change. Likewise, small incremental changes that don't do much, which is most countries' actual domestic policies to climate change are all pretty modest right now, is also not what we actually want to achieve. Now, most of us focus on the big, huge step approach, one big convention, and we'll finally get things done, right? But this is very likely fantastic, but it almost never happens, okay? Big shot deals, we all change behavior overnight. So instead we think that path dependency literature that looks at multiple steps of change, many steps over time leading towards a better result, might provide some promise. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through those, how we might do that. Okay, so we want to think about, does path dependency literature in political science that was never developed to address climate change, might it offer solutions for instrument design that might lock us into a low carbon future? Okay, so now this is going to walk you through and this sort of creative thinking about, is this a possible way to proceed? And I'd love your thoughts. So in the article with Levin, Bernstein and Ald and myself, we identified 3 questions that we think path dependency literature might help us adjudicate when designing policy interventions. And the first question is, what might be done when designing policy to make reversibility difficult? So how can you create sticky policy interventions right away? Okay. And for example, the Endangered Species Act in the United States was passed 30 years ago, and it's been remarkably sticky, durable, because it's so difficult for the US Congress to actually get agreement to change policies. So we know that in the institutional context of the US, you can think about how you might create policy stickiness. The second question is, what can be done to entrench support over time so that you might have immediate lock-in, but over time populations increasingly support the policy? Okay, so it gets more and more durable over time. And then the third question is, what could you do to expand the population that supports the policy? So you go from entrenchment to expansion. Now, if you could do this, you wouldn't need a global convention, because over time, expansion would keep on multiplying so that eventually all populations are covered, if this is a possible way to proceed. Okay, so that's great as the questions, but what does path dependency literature do? Well, it turns out path dependency scholars identify 4 mechanisms that might be useful to think about when trying to answer these 3 questions. Okay, so the first mechanism is lock-in. Okay, so this is when you get the immediate stickiness. Now, lock-in can be caused for many different reasons. It can be the US system of government that makes policy change difficult. It could be sunk costs for a business. Once you have sunk costs in, it's just immediately harder to reverse. You can reverse, but it's harder, right? So the actual focus of the lock-in literature has all kinds of examples in policy studies about how lock-in might be caused. And the trick for the person designing the instrument is to then think about, well, how can I design it to take advantage of a lock-in effect? Okay? Maybe it's creating a bicycle lane, because once you have a bicycle lane, it's there. And maybe that then creates already an interest in generating cycling. It might be a tax incentives for solar panels that then you give to the population, which now that you've given the tax incentive, they want to maintain that tax incentive. Okay? But the reason you do this is not just because of the climate reduction, it's because of the stickiness. Okay, the second way to get path dependency is about self-reinforcing mechanisms that occur over time. And this is when the costs of reversing actually rise over time. So as time too goes on, the cost of reversing is more difficult. This might be, for example, training engineers in engineering schools to produce solar panels and learn about solar technology. Because now, if you reverse it, these engineers have this training and they want to use it. So now you're going to have a mobilization of engineers who are upset with you for not maintaining your solar panel policies. Okay? So it's a different kind of mechanism, but you can see how it helps you design a policy. A third path-dependent process is increasing returns. And this is when the benefits increase over time. So how much you design an instrument to then increase benefits over time? Well, we see this actually happening in Germany. They have these feed-in tariffs over 20 years, where when you buy solar panels, over 20 years, you get more and more benefits from the government for producing this energy. In fact, you get to sell the energy that you overproduce to the grid, and you get paid for that as well. Okay, so benefits accrue over time. And then the fourth one is positive feedbacks. And this is where you expand populations in ways that support the original population when it was a smaller intervention. So how do you expand populations but maintain the original support is a really important feature of addressing this kind of path-dependent process. And we argue that it may be that niche solar power industries actually benefit as more consumers demand solar panels. And so far from removing initial support, you're enhancing initial support. But the literature tells us there are lots of examples where niche small populations do not actually benefit from expansion. And you want to avoid accidentally instruments that lock you into a small population. You want to be able to expand. Okay. Now, this is relatively abstract, but our point is that these thoughts might allow you to think more creatively about bottom-up solutions that might trigger some kind of result. Okay? So I'm going to highlight some key themes in the slide and then stop, and again, I'll share the rest with you. But the overall theme here is that you want to bring then politics into instrument design. When you're sitting around deciding the multitude of efforts now underway in a range of countries to address climate change, you want to think about not just the standards, the commitments, you want to think about the path-dependent processes you might unleash that could become durable. And in the article, we talk about two ways in which this can occur: coalition building and norm generation. So coalitions actually matter in generating support. I'm going to leave you with one example of coalition building process, and it's called the California effect. Okay? Now the California effect was actually also discovered by another political scientist, David Vogel. And what David Vogel found was that some companies, so some profit-maximizing businesses, actually joined with environmental groups to champion increased environmental regulations on their less regulated competitors. Okay? So what happened was California announces a rule. It might be on climate change, it might be on something else. But California loves rules. Okay? And so they have lots of environmental rules that businesses do not like initially because they're at a competitive disadvantage now. But since they couldn't stop the rule, their only recourse is to now actually increase the rules on their competitors. And so this actually happens. The businesses and the environmental groups then lobby other states or national policies to increase and create a level playing field. What happens, therefore, is out of pure self-interest, these companies create a collective good, because environmental policy now keeps on diffusing upwards. And in fact, you now see this phenomenon why we have some greening aspects to international trade rules, because some companies who are regulated highly want a global playing field. And the result is diffused and increased upward protection. So I just want to leave you with this thought, because you want to then design an instrument that might trigger a California effect when thinking about climate change. And this is a bottom-up effort, not a top-down policy. And I'll stop there for now, but it's a way to think about a new way of thinking that might be synergistic with existing approaches that might yield some more long-term results.